The individual known to history as William the Conqueror was born in Falaise, situated in the Normandy region of northern France in either 1027 or 1028. The historical account De Obitu Wilhelmi, meaning on the death of William, composed in the late 11th century to commemorate William's passing in 1087, states that he was 59 years old at the time of his death. If this information is accurate, William's birth must have occurred between September 10, 1027 and September 9, 1028. Like many other noblemen of the High Middle Ages, William's family did not employ a surname. Given that his epithet, the Conqueror, was acquired much later in life, for his first 4 decades, he should be considered simply William of Normandy. His father was Robert of Normandy, who, in 1027, around the time of William's birth, had become the Duke of Normandy, ruler of the extensive duchy in northwest France. This territory dominated the valley of the River Seine as it flowed from Paris to the English Channel. His mother was a woman named Herleva, whose exact background is unclear. One narrative suggests she was a servant in the ducal household at Falaise, while other accounts identify her as the daughter of a local tradesman. One of William's recent biographers proposes she was the daughter of a senior minister to the Dukes of Normandy. Despite the uncertainty surrounding Herleva's background, there is no doubt that her relationship with Robert of Normandy occurred outside the bounds of marriage and was not recognized by the church. Consequently, William was an illegitimate child. Although he would succeed his father, he was consistently referred to throughout his life as bastardus, or the bastard, a reference to his illegitimacy. The Duchy of Normandy, into which William was born and which he would soon govern, was a relatively new territory in France. Its origins date back to the late 9th and early 10th centuries. William's great-great-great-grandfather was Hrolfr Ragnvaldsson, a Viking who, in the late 9th century, led a large Viking contingent conducting raids into the northern parts of the Kingdom of the Franks, in what is now France. However, unlike many other Viking war bands who merely raided regions and moved on, by the 870s, Hrolfr and his Viking followers had settled in the lower Seine River Valley. From this base, they could extract tribute from Paris and cultivate the rich agricultural lands of the Normandy region. This situation persisted until the early 10th century, when the French king, Charles III, decided in 911 to formally incorporate Hrolfr as one of his subjects, rather than endure continued harassment from these Viking warriors. Thus, in 911, Hrolfr became the first Count of Normandy and adopted the name by which he is most commonly known today. He called himself Rollo, and in time his descendants would assume the title of Dukes of Normandy. He was also baptized, initiating the conversion of these Norse settlers in northern France to Christianity throughout the 10th century. William's childhood is relatively obscure compared to the extensive knowledge we have of his later life. He clearly received some form of literary education, but the details are vague except for a piece of information indicating the involvement of a mysterious Ralph the Monk. By the time he was only 7 or 8 years old, the young son of the Duke was already participating in ceremonial events related to the feudal governance of Normandy. For example, when some of Robert's feudal lords paid homage to him, William was present at these ceremonies, recognizing that their fealty would one day transfer to him upon Robert's death and William's succession. One had to mature quickly when destined for lordship in 11th century Europe. Undoubtedly, the most traumatic and pivotal event in William's young life occurred in 1035, when he was either 7 or 8 years old. The boy would have been aware, even at this tender age, of his father's prolonged absence from Falaise. In 1034, Robert had undertaken a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the Holy Land. However, on his journey home, he fell ill and died at Nicaea in northwestern Anatolia, present-day Turkey, on July 2, 1035. When news of his death reached Normandy, the young William, as Robert's only son, despite his illegitimacy, was immediately proclaimed Duke of Normandy. Contemporary rumors suggesting Duke Robert was poisoned in Anatolia are almost certainly unfounded. His sudden illness and death could be attributed to any number of poorly understood maladies of the time. William's rule during his minority was marked by chaos. During Robert's reign, several lords had already wielded excessive power, acting with too much independence from the ducal court at Falaise. With an 8-year-old boy now Duke of Normandy, these tendencies intensified. Consequently, William's guardians spent much of the 1030s and early 1040s attempting to restore ducal authority. The situation deteriorated to the extent that William had to be moved around the Normandy region for his safety. Despite these early challenges, William was able to assume full control of Normandy upon reaching the age of 15, most likely in 1042. From this point onwards, major chroniclers of William's life, such as William of Jumièges and William of Poitiers, began depicting him as central to the events unfolding in Normandy. For instance, William's first documented military success is described as the capture of Falaise from a rebellious local lord named Thurston Gaz. This occurred in early 1043 when William was likely 15 years old. Subsequently, over the following years, he succeeded in re-establishing ducal authority throughout northwestern France, aided considerably by the King of France, Henri IV. The most significant moment in the consolidation of his rule in Normandy occurred in early summer 47, as William approached his 20th birthday. At this time, he successfully repelled a serious challenge to his legitimacy when his cousin, Guy of Brion, asserted his own claim to the duchy. William ultimately defeated Guy at the Battle of Valesdune near Caen in Normandy. Following this victory, he imposed a truce of God on the other Norman nobles. This was a medieval concept prominent in the 11th and 12th centuries, requiring Christian lords to swear oaths of peace towards one another. Following this, William solidified his control over the region by appointing his half-brother Odo as Bishop of Bayeux in 1049, a key position in western Normandy. Throughout their accounts of the events of the 1040s, William's biographers and chroniclers, typically monks and other religious figures writing during his lifetime or shortly after in the late 11th and 12th centuries, took pains to portray the young duke as a primary force behind the duchy's reform and the consolidation of power in his own hands during the 1040s. However, whether these accounts were later embellished remains a matter of some debate. It is also from the late 1040s and into the 1050s that contemporary historical sources first regularly mention figures such as William Fitz-Osbern and Roger de Montgomery serving as William's advisors. These men would continue to advise William for many years, and their appearance in the historical record at this time suggests the formation of a stable and cohesive government in the late 1040s. Several of these individuals would also be William's closest confidants and commanders during his famous invasion of England many years later. Thus, by mid-century, William had strengthened his control over Normandy and ended the instability that had characterized the region since the early 1030s. Having achieved this, William's attention shifted towards securing his lineage. In 1050, he married Matilda of Flanders, the daughter of Count Baldwin of Flanders in present-day southern Belgium. Baldwin was one of Northern Europe's most powerful rulers at the time, making the marriage a significant diplomatic achievement for William. In time, this union would result in 4 sons, Robert, Richard, William, and Henry, and 5 daughters: Adelita, Cecilia, Matilda, Constance, and Adela. 2 of these sons would eventually sit on the throne of England. William's career after 1050 and the events that cemented his place as a major figure in English history must be considered in light of developments in England dating back to the 1010s. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark and ruler of the Danes, a Norse people who had been extensively raiding Britain since the 980s, conquered England and usurped the throne from King Ethelred, head of the Wessex royal line. Although Ethelred quickly counterattacked and reclaimed the kingship in 1014, he died in 1016, making his son, Edmund Ironside, the new king. Despite Knut's dominance, the Wessex lineage was not entirely extinguished. In 1016, Ethelred's other son and Edmund Ironside's brother, Edward, fled across the English Channel with the rest of the family. They found refuge at the court of the Dukes of Normandy, where they were treated as exiled kings of England and received numerous honors from William's grandfather and father throughout the 1020s and 1030s. Then in the early 1040s, just as William was entering young adulthood and preparing to rule in his own right, the situation in England changed once more. Knut was succeeded in 1035 by his son, Harold Harefoot, who died in 1040, only to be succeeded by another of Knut's sons, Harthacnut. However, Harthacnut was a young man without an heir and suffered from an unspecified illness, possibly tuberculosis. Consequently, in 1041, he made provisions for the succession in the event of his death. His arrangement for England was that Edward, now known by the epithet the Confessor, due to his religious piety, should return from Normandy and succeed him as King of England, should he die without producing an heir. This occurred the following year. Thus, the Wessex line of kings was restored in England in 1042. Edward did not forget the support he had received from the Dukes of Normandy and the honors bestowed upon his family in northern France throughout their long exile over the quarter century since 1016. Although there is significant controversy surrounding these events, it is highly plausible that in 1051, during a crisis between Edward and the powerful Anglo-Danish House of Godwin, the king promised William of Normandy that he would succeed him as King of England upon his death. Edward was without a legitimate heir and largely led a celibate life. There is considerable evidence supporting the assertion that this promise was indeed made in 1051. Many of our most important sources for William's life attest to it. For example, the Gesta Wilhelmi, or Deeds of William, written by William of Poitiers around 1066, and the Gesta Normanorum Ducum, or Deeds of the Dukes of the Normans, compiled by William of Jumièges around 1070. Both include this version of events. However, these accounts could be dismissed as politically biased, having been written after William claimed the English throne and conquered the country. But evidence also exists in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a lengthy history of England in the Middle Ages, which predates William becoming king. Recent studies have proven that the relevant sections of the Chronicle detailing Edward's promise to William were written in the 1050s or early 1060s, before William became King of England. Consequently, the author would have had no political motive to include this version of events if it were untrue. Therefore, there is strong reason to believe that Edward did in fact designate William as his heir in 1051, and that the Norman Duke's claim to the English throne was authentic and substantial as a result. Regardless of the nuances of these matters, their material significance for William would not become a pressing concern for another 15 years, as Edward lived well into the 1060s. In the intervening period, William faced further challenges within Normandy. Despite his earlier alliance with Henri III of France, William clashed with the French monarch on several occasions in the 1050s, and this was a consequence of the fragmented and decentralized power structure prevalent in France throughout the 11th century. The broader complex eventually became known as the Abbey of Sainte Trinité. Throughout the late medieval and early modern periods, it stood as one of northern France's most impressive religious establishments. However, it was not fully completed until 1130, long after both William and Matilda had passed away, an indication of the project's sheer ambition. Upon completion, it featured a main church built in the Gothic style, with transepts extending from the rear into the abbeys for the nuns and monks. These transepts were constructed in the early medieval Romanesque architectural style. Thus, the church and abbeys at Caen, patronized by William, represent a synthesis of the main architectural styles of both the early and high Middle Ages, symbolizing a world like the Duchy of Normandy, standing at the transition between historical periods in Europe. Having secured Normandy's southern border, William turned his attention west in 1064 towards the Celtic Duchy of Brittany and its ruler, Conan the Senon. This initiated the Breton-Norman War, which lasted until 1066, ultimately ending in a relative stalemate. It is noteworthy for involving Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex in England and head of the powerful House of Godwin. Harold had most likely been dispatched to France to reaffirm King Edward's earlier offer to William to succeed him as England's ruler. At this time, William extracted an oath from Harold that he would accept his succession. The meeting of William and Harold in northern France in the mid-1060s acquired significant consequence in early 1066. King Edward the Confessor, by then in his 60s, fell into a coma late in 1065. He never fully recovered and died on January 5, 1066 in London. He still lacked a clear heir. Edward's ambiguity and indecisiveness regarding the succession created an opening for Harold. The following day, on January 6th, the Anglo-Saxon Witenagemot, the Assembly of Anglo-Saxon and Danish lords and members of England's ruling class, convened and proclaimed Harold the new King of England. The stage was now set for a major confrontation with William. Within weeks, preparations were underway in Normandy for William to assert his claim as Edward's successor. Indeed, it is almost certain that William had been politically and militarily preparing for Edward's death throughout the 1060s. Hundreds of warships and transport vessels were now being assembled or constructed in the ports of northern France. William reached out to his newly acquired subjects and allies across northern France to assist him in his invasion. Debate has arisen in recent years concerning how William actually prepared his invasion force. By some standards, this was the largest amphibious invasion and military operation undertaken in Western Europe since the days of the Roman Empire. However, compared to William, who was merely the duke of a minor principality in northern France, the Romans were the dominant power of the known world, and capable of massive logistical undertakings. Consequently, many medievalists and historians have pondered how William managed to assemble such an invasion force and transport it across the English Channel in such a short time frame. What historians specializing in this period increasingly believe is that the Norman invasion of 1066 was made possible only by the dissemination of new technologies to northern France from other parts of Europe during the 11th century. For instance, William's army would have included over 3,000 war horses. Studies have concluded that the types of long ships and galleys used in the North Atlantic during the early Middle Ages could not have transported these horses across the English Channel in anywhere near the necessary time frame for him to have conducted his campaign in 1066. Instead, William relied on a specific type of ship for horse transport, the design of which had reached Normandy from the Byzantine Empire in the eastern Mediterranean during the first half of the 11th century. Thus, from a logistical perspective, the Norman invasion of 1066 and William's expedition were only possible due to the changing nature of medieval Europe in the 11th century and the increasing diffusion of knowledge and technologies across the continent. William was not the sole claimant to the throne. Harold also faced a challenge from his own brother Tostig, Earl of Northumberland. As the Earl of a large domain in northern England and a member of the powerful House of Godwin, Tostig possessed considerable support for his own claim to the throne. He had already been implicated in a rebellion in the north in 1065 prior to Edward's final illness and death. Now, in 1066, he clashed directly with Harold, who banished him from England. Tostig spent the spring and summer months scheming with various foreign powers in the North Atlantic world. He sought refuge with his brother-in-law, Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, who provided him with financial and military support to raid southern England in the summer. Tostig even considered aligning himself with William, but ultimately he looked further east to Norway. At some point in the summer of 1066, he made contact with King Harald Hardrada of Norway and persuaded the Norse monarch to press his own claim to the English throne. Harald Hardrada received Tostig's proposition favorably. He swiftly assembled an invasion force of approximately 10,000 men and 300 ships, which landed in northern England in early autumn. Initially, Hardrada and Tostig achieved good progress, securing a significant victory against regional forces outside York at Fulford on September 20th, 1066. However, in the ensuing days, Harold himself arrived in the north with his armies. The forces of English King Harold and Norwegian King Harold finally met at the village of Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire on September 25th, 1066. The result was a stunning victory for the English Harold. Both Hardrada and Tostig were killed in the engagement, and thousands of Norwegians were killed or severely wounded. Such was the scale of the defeat that only 2 to 3 dozen of the 300 ships that had transported the Norse army to England were needed to carry the remnants of the army back to Norway. Harold had repelled the first major threat to his rule, but the greater one awaited to the south. The distraction created by Hardrada's northern invasion was not insignificant in the subsequent campaign. Having spent the summer rallying his allies and supporters in France, William's invasion force, estimated to be between 8,000 and 12,000 men, crossed the English Channel on the night of September 27th, making their full landing near Pevensey in East Sussex on the morning of the 28th. This date is crucial because Harold had been making preparations in the south throughout the summer and early autumn against William's expected landing. However, the invasion by Hardrada and Tostig in the north had drawn his forces away, allowing William a smoother landing in the south. Thus, the stage was set for the ultimate confrontation between Harold and William. After disembarking, William moved his forces to the nearby town of Hastings in late September and early October. In the process, his troops devastated the surrounding Sussex countryside, requisitioning food supplies for his army and simultaneously employing psychological warfare. No sooner had he defeated Hardrada in the north than Harold had to make a rapid southward journey to confront the second invasion. William, conversely, did not advance north towards London and Harold's forces. He was content to wait for Harold to come to him in Sussex. His reasons were twofold. First, he had established a strong operational base at Hastings, with ample supplies gathered from the surrounding region. Second, he did not wish to sever his communication lines with his fleet by moving inland. Clearly, William was anticipating the possibility of an unfavorable military outcome against Harold and preparing for a potential hasty retreat back across the Channel to Normandy. By October the 13th, Harold had advanced south to the vicinity of William's position at Hastings. Upon receiving intelligence of the king's arrival in East Sussex in his encampment northeast of the town, William prepared his troops and marched out from Hastings shortly after dawn on the morning of the 14th. The ensuing battle, one of the most pivotal in English history, is known as the Battle of Hastings, although it did not actually occur within or immediately adjacent to the town of Hastings itself. Instead, the clash took place approximately 11 kilometers northwest of the town, near a steep ridge in the Sussex countryside. The area is now the site of the village of Battle, named in commemoration of the conflict that occurred there nearly a millennium ago. The precise details of how the battle unfolded are subject to some debate, partly because contemporary historical accounts often significantly distorted events for political reasons in the aftermath. For example, the number of troops involved is typically greatly exaggerated. Nevertheless, historians today generally agree on the fundamental facts of the battle. William led at least 7,000 men, and possibly as many as 10,000 out of Hastings. A large proportion of this force consisted of Norman heavy cavalry, considered the elite warriors of 11th century Europe. Harold commanded a comparable number of troops, but they were fatigued from the month-long effort of marching north to Yorkshire and then quickly returning south, having fought the Battle of Stamford Bridge along the way. The battle began in the early morning at Battle and continued throughout the day, a lengthy engagement for the era. Harold's forces held the strategic advantage of the high ground, having occupied the ridge at the site. However, their movement was restricted by the Weald Forest at their rear. Thus, while William's forces were disadvantaged by having to advance uphill, they had greater maneuverability across the battlefield. Ultimately, three factors determined the outcome. William effectively deployed his archers to target Harold's troops on the ridge. His cavalry was superior to Harold's, and most significantly, William's generalship was decisive. Throughout the day, he utilized a series of feigned or deceptive retreats to disrupt the English lines and exploit weak points in Harold's formation. These attacks gradually depleted the ranks of Harold's elite troops, the housecarls, who formed the English shield wall. Auxiliary troops replaced the housecarls, but eventually, the relentless barrage of feigned attacks and strikes at vulnerable points in the English king's shield wall proved fatal. During one of these staged retreats late in the day, Harold himself was struck down and killed. With the king dead, the Anglo-Saxon and Danish forces reportedly broke. Many fled, while others surrendered. Thus, by the time the sun set on October 14, 1066, over the field at Battle and near Hastings, Harold Godwinson lay dead, and William of Normandy was one significant step closer to claiming the English throne. Any evaluation of the Battle of Hastings must also consider the maxim that history is written by the victors. Our sources for the battle and, indeed, much of the broader Norman conquest of England stem almost exclusively from Norman writers, sympathetic to William and predictably critical of Harold, or from sources like the Bayeux Tapestry, which were unequivocally propaganda pieces designed to glorify William's victory. For instance, many sources suggest Harold was killed late in the battle by an arrow striking his eye, while others contend he died early in the conflict. Regardless of the timing, nearly all sources assert that Harold's army began to disintegrate and flee upon their king's death, portraying a disordered and poorly trained force. However, other less favorable accounts of William maintain that Harold's forces remained quite cohesive even after the king's death, attempting to retreat with his body. For nearly 3 centuries, the region encompassing Scandinavia, Britain, northern France, and the Low Countries had been dominated by the military might of the Vikings, who surged out of Europe in the late 8th century with their longships and infantry warriors. Hastings signaled the triumph of Franco-Norman military tactics with their combined infantry and cavalry forces over the Anglo-Saxon and Danish troops that had long held sway in the North Atlantic. In the aftermath of the battle, William did not immediately assume the English crown. This was complicated by the Witan's lords in London proclaiming a new king. Their choice was Edgar Atheling, a grandnephew of King Edward the Confessor and grandson of King Edmund Ironside, who had briefly ruled England 50 years earlier in 1016. When news of Harold's defeat and death at Hastings reached London days later, the decision was made to crown Edgar, then perhaps 13 years old, as king. Edgar's reign would be one of the shortest in English history. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Hastings, William proceeded cautiously, securing the towns of Dover, Canterbury, and Winchester before attempting to seize London. By doing so, he consolidated control over the South and Midlands and isolated the supporters of the boy king in the capital. Just weeks later, as William's armies advanced towards London, the young king's supporters decided against prolonging the pretense of resistance against William. The boy king and his supporters met with William near the capital in early December, where an agreement was reached allowing Edgar to abdicate peacefully. This action, along with the capture of London, completed the initial Norman conquest. William of Normandy was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066. The ceremony was presided over by Aldred, the Archbishop of York, who performed it in English. Bishop Geoffrey of Coutances, from a diocese in Normandy, then translated Aldred's words into French. This ceremony symbolically underscored the fact that a foreign power had effectively conquered England, in an ominous foreshadowing of the bloodshed that would characterize much of William's reign in England. Some of William's soldiers stationed outside the abbey, hearing what were actually shouts of acclamation from within, mistakenly believed William had been assassinated. In a panic, they began setting fire to surrounding buildings in Westminster. It is following this rather chaotic coronation ceremony that William is no longer referred to as William of Normandy, but instead becomes William Norman, or as he is more commonly known to history, William the Conqueror. It would be inaccurate to suggest that the transformation that occurred in England in 1066 was limited to a few decisive battles and a change of ruler, after which stability quickly returned. England had been conquered by a foreign power that introduced new forms of governance, legal systems, cultural norms, and even a different language. As we will see over the next 2 decades of his life, William and his Norman followers would transform England from a hybrid Anglo-Saxon and Danish land into a new Anglo-Norman kingdom. As Richard Southern, a renowned historian of medieval England, once observed, no country in Europe, between the rise of the barbarian kingdoms in the 5th century and the 20th century, has undergone so radical a change in so short a time as England experienced after 1066. Some of these changes were immediate. The shifting order saw thousands of Anglo-Saxons and Danes who had been strong supporters of the House of Wessex or the Danish lords flee England for destinations such as Denmark, Norway, Scotland, or even neighboring Ireland. Many would attempt to organize new invasions to restore the old Anglo-Saxon and Danish rule, but most would never return. In their place, William brought in thousands of Norman settlers from France, perhaps as many as 20,000. These medieval colonists did not significantly dilute the existing population, which is estimated to have been around 2.5 million people in England by the mid-11th century. However, they established a strong Norman presence in positions of authority throughout towns and villages across 11th century England. Over time, these newcomers fundamentally altered English society. The most evident and lasting manifestation of this transformation was the introduction of the conqueror's language, Anglo-Norman, a dialect of Old French with some Norse elements reflecting the Normans' Viking heritage. Eventually, a significant portion of Anglo-Norman vocabulary was absorbed into English, fundamentally altering the language into a hybrid of Germanic and Romance languages. This process of linguistic assimilation would take centuries to fully complete. For the remainder of William's reign, the ruling class spoke a version of French, while the majority of the population continued to speak Old English. Consequently, bilingualism became necessary for many individuals working in government or engaged in trade in London and other towns from the late 1060s onwards. Alongside this linguistic shift, changes also occurred in the functioning of government and law. Law French became the language of the courts, a position it would hold legally until the 18th century. Furthermore, the court system became more centralized under Norman rule, a development that facilitated the growth of the... While these figures are undoubtedly somewhat inexact due to the challenges of precise record-keeping in the 11th century, this clearly represented a substantial reduction from the number of enslaved people present in the country prior to 1066. This suggests that William and his followers had manumitted or freed many enslaved individuals following the conquest. This process continued thereafter. Slavery was not formally abolished in England, nor indeed in most of Europe, until the 19th century, but it was gradually phased out. By the 12th century, the number of enslaved people in England had declined by as much as 30% compared to pre-1066 figures, and this process continued through the 12th and 13th centuries. By the late Middle Ages, slavery was considered unacceptable in England, as elsewhere in Europe, when applied to fellow Christians. Another very substantial change initiated by William was his reform of the English Church. At the time of the conquest, the Church in England was relatively loosely organized. William centralized its structure significantly and appointed several followers to senior positions to impose uniformity. Lanfranc, a celebrated Benedictine monk, was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070, the same year that William's chaplain, William of Bayeux, was made Archbishop of York. Together, this pair oversaw the creation of a centralized Anglican church that sought to maintain a degree of independence from the papacy in Rome on numerous matters, an independent streak within Anglicanism that foreshadowed many developments in the English church in later years. However, the most fundamental changes implemented throughout England following the Norman conquest occurred in the realm of land ownership. William had numerous followers who had supported him not only in his campaign against Harold in 1066, but also during various periods when he required their military and political support in the 1040s and 1050s. England was now their reward. The Domesday Book offers insight into the magnitude of this land redistribution. It comprises a vast survey of land ownership in 11th century England, compiled 2 decades after the Norman conquest. This was the most comprehensive account of land ownership in the country until the 19th century. The survey reveals how William rewarded his French and Norman adherents in the aftermath of the conquest by granting them vast territories across the country. Leading lords and loyal followers were bestowed with enormous estates. These often encompassed significant tracts of land in geographically strategic regions, which they were also expected to control on behalf of the Normans, the conquerors of this foreign territory. For instance, one of William's staunchest supporters, Robert de Beaumont, heir to the title of Count of Moulins in Normandy, had fought alongside William at Hastings. He was rewarded with over 90 manors in England in the years that followed, strategically centered around Warwickshire and Leicestershire. Thus, this prominent companion of William was entrusted with controlling the English Midlands for Norman interests and granted extensive estates in the region to facilitate this over the ensuing years. The new Norman stone castles, which surpassed the wooden Motte and Bailey fortifications favored by the Danes and Anglo-Saxons in England up to that time, began appearing throughout the countryside as a means of securing Norman rule in case of Anglo-Saxon and Danish resistance. In recognition of his immense authority in the area, Robert was later made the first Earl of Leicester. He was not alone in being placed in such a position. Another senior companion of William's in 1066, William de Warenne, was granted lands in at least 13 counties by the 1080s, particularly concentrated around Sussex and Surrey. He was ennobled shortly before his death in 1088 as the first Earl of Surrey. William Fitz-Osbern, the Lord of Breteuil in Normandy, was a close associate of William and also related to the Conqueror. He was granted a prominent position in the West Midlands in the March region bordering Wales, particularly in the counties of Herefordshire, Gloucestershire, and Monmouthshire. Here he was given Clifford Castle, Berkeley Castle, and Monmouth Castle as imposing symbols of Norman rule. Fortifications he significantly expanded. He was also quickly made Earl of Hereford to signify his preeminent position in the English West Midlands. Through these measures, William and his Norman companions imposed their rule over England in the years following the conquest. This was not a benevolent conquest. Such vast land transfers severely displaced people and utterly disrupted English society. Furthermore, the conquest itself in late 1066 caused severe devastation to the countryside of southern England. It was not long before it incited resistance. In 1067, William had returned to France to oversee his domains there. Unrest began to escalate as soon as he departed. Upon his return to England later that year, William Fitz-Osbern had already initiated an extensive castle-building program to assert greater control over regions beyond London and the home counties. In early 1068, William campaigned in the West Country, where Norman rule was being resisted. It is difficult to overstate Fitz-Osbern's role in this aspect of the conquest for his cousin. In addition to establishing castles in the West Midlands and the March region, where he served as the Conqueror's primary representative, he initiated the construction of numerous other castles in southern England on the new king's behalf. These included Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight, where Romans had built a fort a millennium earlier, later adapted by Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. Fitz-Osbern oversaw the construction of a new castle here, which would later gain notoriety as the place where King Charles I was imprisoned by Parliament in 1648 before his trial and execution. This was a brutal military action, with William devastating the countryside of northern England. A nearly contemporary chronicler, Orderic Vitalis, generally regarded as an accurate chronicler who did not sympathize with the Norman conquerors, described William as bringing, quote, famine and the sword to northern England in 1069. His description is corroborated by the evidence of the Domesday Book, which showed that land values in northern England were still enormously lower in the 1080s than they otherwise should have been, a sign of the extensive damage William and his followers inflicted on the region to suppress its independence. Further campaigns followed in 1070 in the northwest along the coastline near Chester and the March region bordering Wales. New castles were quickly erected and Norman overlords imposed their will. The last significant pockets of resistance in these areas were not finally crushed until 1071. Thus, we might consider that far from being a brief military conquest in 1066, the Norman conquest was actually a prolonged 6-year campaign during which England was subjugated by the Normans through a brutal strategy involving military conquest, enforced famine, and the replacement of the Anglo-Saxon and Danish aristocracy with a new nobility of Norman knights ruling the country from their imposing stone castles. The campaign in northern England, known as the Harrowing of the North, represented the apex of this destructive campaign. Between 1069 and 1071, the countryside around towns and cities like York was effectively laid waste, leading to such severe famine and displacement that it is now understood that tens of thousands of people likely starved to death in northern England at this time. In some parts of the northern counties, the population had declined by as much as 75% even years later, a consequence of the methods employed by the Normans here during the conquest. Many people simply fled to Scotland and overseas in the wake of the Normans' arrival. Thus, the Norman conquest of England was not a smooth transfer of power from one ruler to another, resulting from a battle in southern England in 1066, but an extremely bloody process that disrupted the lives of people across England for many years. These reverential accounts of William the Conqueror would shape his perception in a very positive light for centuries to come. Other efforts were more visual and symbolic. Pope Alexander II in Rome ordered in 1070 that William and his followers perform penance for the sins committed in killing many people during the conquest and in the months and years thereafter. William seized this as an opportunity to further glorify the conquest. The penance he undertook was to commission the construction of an abbey for the Benedictine religious order. It was to be built on the battlefield northeast of Hastings, the site where William had effectively secured the English throne in October 1066. The church altar within the abbey was reportedly placed at the precise location where Harold had fallen during the battle. Dedicated to St. Martin, Battle Abbey was completed only after William's death, but stands as a striking example of Norman propaganda in England. The abbey, as it still exists today, is dominated towards the front by 2 large crenellated towers between the main gatehouse and entryways. Further battlements extend from there, creating the impression of a defensive structure, although it was intended as a residence for the largest religious order in 11th century Europe. Elements of the abbey have either suffered damage over the intervening millennium since its construction or were relocated for safekeeping at various times, such as during the English Civil Wars of the mid-17th century. One such element is understood to have been a triple light stained glass window depicting St. John the Baptist in the crucifixion of Jesus. The abbey is also believed to have housed the Battle Abbey Roll, a commemorative roster of the principal companions who accompanied William on his 1066 expedition to England and fought at Hastings. While historians of medieval England generally accept that the Battle Abbey Roll existed, it has not survived to the present day. Consequently, William's decision to commemorate his allies and companions in this manner is known to us only secondhand from accounts like Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles, written in the late 16th century. More renowned than Battle Abbey and the Battle Abbey Roll is the Bayeux Tapestry mentioned previously. Its precise origins are not entirely clear, but it is presumed to have been commissioned either by William's wife, Matilda, or his half-brother Odo, Earl of Kent and Bishop of Bayeux. Yet even if Odo commissioned it, it is highly improbable that William was unaware of the project or had not granted his approval. As a visual representation of the official history of the Norman conquest, displayed in Bayeux Cathedral from 1077 onwards, the tapestry would have conveyed to William's subjects in Normandy the narrative he wished them to believe about how he had ascended to the English throne. It comprises 58 distinct scenes, many with Latin captions to aid viewer interpretation. These primarily depict events between 1064 and 1066, commencing with Harold's visit to France and his acknowledgement of William as King Edward's designated successor. As such, the scenes underscore the contested nature of the English kingship in the 2 years preceding William's invasion of England. The tapestry concludes with his victory at Hastings. Throughout, it seeks to legitimize the conqueror's claim to the English throne legally, based on the events of the mid-1060s, and then celebrate his military triumph in southern England when he chose to enforce his claim through force of arms. A providential aspect is also integrated into the narrative, with one scene featuring Halley's Comet and depicting a future vision of an invasion fleet. The intended message is that William's invasion and victory were divinely ordained, and the comet's appearance over England in 1066 was seen as an omen favoring William's cause. Overall, the Bayeux Tapestry represents a highly sophisticated piece of political propaganda for the 11th century, asserting the just nature of William's ascent as King of England and the Norman conquest of Britain. In the aftermath of the country's final subjugation, William clearly articulated his priorities concerning his domains. His priorities lay in France, and for the remaining 15 years of his life, he would spend approximately 4/5 of his time in Normandy and other parts of the continent, returning to England only for brief intervals. Our natural tendency to assume William would have made England his primary residence in the 1070s is based on our knowledge of England's later emergence as a global power. However, in the context of 11th century Europe, the true core of William's territories resided in France, closer to the center of Norman and French culture, which was gradually expanding its influence in conquering many other parts of Europe, notably large portions of southern Italy and Sicily. He was also needed in France due to unrest that erupted there in the mid-1070s. This conflict compelled him into several years of military campaigning. First, he had to regain control of the county of Maine in 1073, following a revolt that had broken out there during his absence in England. Then he campaigned against the French, whose power was being reasserted under the new monarch, Philippe I. These difficulties in France were not the only challenges William faced in the 1070s. In 1070, King Sweyn II of Denmark, despite assurances to William that he would withdraw any Danish troops from England and cease interfering in the region, personally led an expedition across the North Sea. There, he allied with a prominent Anglo-Saxon rebel, Hereward the Wake, who had attracted many opponents of the Normans to his cause. Hereward effectively controlled the Isle of Ely in eastern England and parts of the nearby Fens region at this time. Sweyn now brought additional troops to reinforce the rebels here. William managed to placate the Danish king by paying a substantial Danegeld, a tribute paid by an English king to the Danes given intermittently since the 9th century. However, the rebellion in the Fens proved more difficult to suppress, partly because the marshy terrain of the Fens was unfavorable for the Normans to deploy their heavy cavalry against Hereward and his forces. The stalemate was broken only when William arrived in 1071 to take personal command of the campaign. A pontoon bridge was constructed between the mainland and the Isle of Ely, allowing William and his troops to assault Hereward's main stronghold. Subsequently, several rebel leaders were either executed or imprisoned, while others were pardoned and effectively bought off with new land grants to secure their loyalty. Hereward may have been among the latter, but accounts conflict, with some claiming he fled into exile in Scotland after the rebellion was crushed in 1071. This was not the end of William's troubles in England. In 1075, a new revolt erupted in the country, though this time it did not originate from Anglo-Saxon or Danish lords unreconciled to the Norman conquest. Instead, it stemmed from among William's own Norman subjects. The origins of this rebellion lay in the marriage of Emma Fitzosborne, daughter of William Fitzosborne, the king's great companion and first Earl of Hereford, who had died in Flanders in 1071, to Ralph de Guater, another prominent Norman lord in England whom the Conqueror had ennobled as the Earl of East Anglia in 1069. The king had refused to sanction this marriage, but Emma and Ralph proceeded with it while the king was in France in 1075. However, the true instigator behind this act of defiance was not Emma or Ralph, but Emma's brother Roger, who had succeeded their father as the second Earl of Hereford in 1071. In the intervening years, he had developed ambitions to carve out his own independent principality in England, taking advantage of the king's absence. William had spent most of his time since the Norman conquest in northern France. Thus, in 1075, Roger arranged his sister's marriage to the Earl of East Anglia. aiming to form an alliance with de Guaiter and launch a joint revolt against William's rule in England. Eventually, she negotiated terms allowing herself and her new husband to retire peacefully to lands they held in Brittany, northwestern France, in exchange for relinquishing their English estates. The Earl of Hereford was not so fortunate. William imprisoned him following the rebellion's suppression. He remained confined for the rest of the king's reign, while the revolt of the earls in 1075 posed a clear threat to William's rule in England. Albeit one easily overcome due to fortunate circumstances, the most pressing issue for William in the 1070s was a family dispute that arose between 1077 and 1080, between William and his eldest son and designated heir Robert. William had entrusted Robert with governing Normandy upon his departure for England in 1066. The dispute may well have stemmed from Robert's dashed expectations that he would effectively rule the French duchy thereafter, with William residing and contenting himself with his new English domains. The conflict, though resolved by 1080, foreshadowed rivalries that would plague the family for years. It was also during this time that he traveled deep into Wales, initially on a pilgrimage to St. David's in the country's far west, but also as a means of asserting some form of overlordship over the Welsh princes there. This marked the beginning of a longer, intermittent process by which English rule was established in Wales during the late Middle Ages. The final years of William's reign were in many ways an anticlimax after the towering achievements of the 1060s, when the Normans had unified such significant parts of Britain and France under one ruler. A further conflict erupted with Robert in 1084, resulting in his exile from the Norman court. He did not return during William's lifetime. The mid-1080s also witnessed an emergency in England concerning an anticipated invasion by a combined force of Danes and Flemish troops led by Knut IV, King of Denmark. Knut sought to challenge William's control of England, demonstrating Norman callousness towards their English subjects. The new lords of the country implemented a scorched earth policy throughout eastern England in preparation for the invasion. The aim was to deny any invading army sustenance from crops and other supplies. In the event, the invasion never materialized as Knut died in Denmark before it set sail. However, the Domesday Book attests to the devastation inflicted on eastern England by the Normans, who prioritized the military advantage over the damage to local communities. The perception of England as a country militarily occupied by the Normans in the 1070s and 1080s, rather than a nation liberated by the benevolent Duke of Normandy, is further reinforced by William's ongoing construction program in the latter part of his reign. Much of this involved continuing the castle building initiated in the late 1060s across England, but other elements held greater symbolic significance. For example, in 1078, William commenced construction of a new military fortress on the edge of London, the beginnings of what is now known as the Tower of London. The initial structure, today called the White Tower, is the most iconic part of the tower. It was effectively a military compound overlooking London, designed to intimidate William's new subjects. The inhabitants of the capital had, after all, attempted to crown Edgar Atheling as a new king, rather than accept William as their monarch after his victory at Hastings in 1066. William's distrust of Londoners evidently lingered long afterward. For centuries to come, this served as England's central security hub, storing ordnance and weapons well into modern times. William made a clear statement by erecting such an imposing military complex on London's outskirts. He was conveying to his new subjects in the capital of England that if they attempted to support a new pretender or aid his enemies, he could swiftly strike against them. The tower, dominating the city's skyline and visible to all vessels entering and leaving London via the River Thames, was a bold declaration of military power. There is also a possibility rarely discussed in studies of William the Conqueror's reign, but not entirely implausible, that he considered a military campaign westward to Ireland during the latter stages of his rule. Ireland had been a difficult challenge for powers operating from France and Britain in earlier periods. The Romans, for instance, never attempted to conquer the island, though they were familiar with what they called Hibernia and its geography and politics. The English crown would not launch a full invasion of the Western Island for nearly a century after William's time, when Henry II sanctioned an expedition there in the late 1160s. However, there is evidence suggesting William maintained contact with some of the primary regional lords and rulers there in the late 1070s and early 1080s, notably the O'Briens of Thomond and Munster in the southern part of the country. Ireland was not unified but divided into numerous different polities frequently at war with each other. The idea that William was contemplating a military expedition against this politically fragmented region in the final years of his life is strengthened by a passage in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles stating that William would have conquered Ireland had he lived a few more years, fueling the notion that he was planning a new westward campaign across the Irish Sea. If this were the case, it seems probable that William's objective was more to cut off any support the Welsh and Scottish were receiving from Ireland, rather than to actually conquer the country. Regardless, it is a curious and largely forgotten footnote to William's later reign that William spent Christmas 1085 at Gloucester. It was during his time there that the Domesday Book was commissioned. This was more commonly referred to in its own day as the Winchester Roll or Liber de Wintonia, meaning the Book of Winchester as it was housed at Winchester. It gradually became known as the Domesday Book from the late 12th century onwards, the reference being to Doomsday, reflecting the perceived finality of its records of landholding in Anglo-Norman England. The undertaking to produce it was immense by the standards of the 11th century. William dispatched crown agents and officials to survey every shire in England and compile lists of land ownership in each district, including the extent of land and the owner's property in the form of goods and enslaved people. The number of officials involved must have been considerable, considering some details unearthed during the survey. For instance, Domesday records the presence of 5,224 mills built in communities across England, a level of socio-economic data entirely atypical of medieval sources. Administrative exercises of this kind were complex undertakings in the Middle Ages, and it is a testament to his dedication to assessing the landholding situation of his new kingdom that William initiated it at all. It is also remarkable how quickly the commissioners and crown officials managed to complete their work. It is likely that portions of the Domesday Book were presented to William during his tour of southern England in 1086. However, he would never have seen the finalized text in the format. It exists today at the National Archives of the United Kingdom at Kew in London, as it was not fully completed and compiled until after his death. It is fitting that one of William's final acts as king was to order its compilation. The Domesday Book presented a striking depiction of how the Norman conquest had transformed England. Of the approximately 2,400 Anglo-Saxon and Danish tenants-in-chief who constituted England's upper landholding class prior to 1066, only 2 remained in place in 1086 when the Domesday Book was compiled. Several thousand free men and free women below these tenants-in-chief still held lands their families possessed prior to the conquest. However, they now owed service and taxes, both in kind and in cash, to their new Norman overlords. These overlords had been strategically positioned throughout England and resided in the many stone castles erected in the 20 years since William of Normandy became William I of England. The fame of the Domesday Book and the administrative effort involved evidently spread beyond England in subsequent years. Around the turn of the century, the Norman rulers of Sicily attempted a similar survey of landholding across the Italian island, inspired by the conqueror's undertaking in England a decade and a half earlier. This serves as a testament to the fact that, beyond being a military leader, William was also a modernizing administrator and ruler. William left England for the final time in autumn 1086. He returned to France, where his enemies on that side of the Channel, including the King of France, had once again exploited his absence in England to attack his possessions in Normandy and elsewhere. In 1087, he stabilized the situation and then campaigned towards Paris. This would be his last military action in a life that had encompassed nearly 50 years of warfare. In July, while conducting a siege of Mantes, northwest of Paris, he fell ill, possibly due to a riding accident where his saddle pommel inflicted a severe abdominal injury. As a result of this injury, he was moved back north to Normandy, first to Rouen and then to the Abbey of Saint-Gervais outside the town. It was here on September 9, 1087, at approximately 60 years of age, that the conqueror of England, the Norman who had united significant parts of France and England under one ruler, finally passed away. The matter of succession was more complex. As early as 1063, William had designated his eldest son Robert as his successor as Duke of Normandy. However, the succession to the English throne had never been fully resolved, and the falling out between William and Robert suggested that Robert would not succeed him there. Furthermore, it was a common practice among the Normans for multiple sons to divide their father's inheritance. However, the second son, Richard, had predeceased William, dying in 1081. The next eldest son was William, known as William Rufus due to his red beard. The arrangement reached was that Robert would succeed to the Duchy of Normandy, as agreed in 1063, but William would succeed his father as King William II of England. The fourth son, Henry, received very little, although he would eventually succeed William II as King of England many years later in 1100. As perhaps befitted William the Conqueror's life and the bloodshed that followed him, his sons would spend many years after 1087 at war with each other for power in the political world of northern France and England. When Henry himself died in 1135, England was once again plunged into civil war. William's body and tomb have experienced a turbulent history after his death. He was laid to rest in the Abbey of Saint Etienne in Caen, Normandy, adjacent to the Abbey of Sainte Trinité, whose construction he and his wife Matilda had patronized in the early 1060s. The first disturbances surrounding his tomb occurred on the day of William's funeral, when a local peasant disrupted the proceedings, claiming the land on which the religious buildings were erected rightfully belonged to him. Subsequently, as the conqueror's body was being lowered into the tomb that same day, it was discovered that the passage was too narrow. Forcing the body through damaged it, emitting a putrefying odor. Thus, William's damaged corpse was interred. It was exhumed for the first time in 1522 on the orders of Pope Adrian VI. The exact reason for this exhumation is unclear, but after a local French cardinal examined the embalmed body and the tomb, it was quickly reinterred. However, this was just the first of many exhumations during the early modern period. 40 years later, as the French Wars of Religion erupted across France in the 1560s, a mob of Calvinists in Normandy opened the tomb, suspecting that Roman Catholics in Caen had concealed treasure or other valuables within William's tomb. Some of the conqueror's remains were reportedly damaged and destroyed at this time. What remained was eventually reinterred, but only until the early 1790s when, following the French Revolution, a new mob once again desecrated the tomb. This time, most of William's bones were cast into the River Orne. Only a single thigh bone survived. This thigh bone was eventually exhumed again in 1961 and formally placed in a new tomb, marked by a marble slab in front of the altar of the Abbaye aux Hommes in Caen in 1987. It is there that the small remnant of the conqueror's bones rests today. There is no doubt that William of Normandy, who became William the Conqueror, was one of the most significant figures in English history and one of medieval Europe's most impactful rulers. Having assumed control of a relatively unstable duchy in northern France, at the young age of 7 or 8, he succeeded in his young adulthood not only in securing his position in Normandy, but also in asserting his authority over the King of France and effectively conquering the County of Maine in the late 1050s and early 1060s. At the zenith of his power in France, he began campaigning west into the Duchy of Brittany in 1064. It was at this moment, when his military and political influence on the continent was perhaps at its peak during his lifetime, that Edward the Confessor died in England without an heir. The result was a military invasion in 1066, the Battle of Hastings that October, and William's coronation as King of England on Christmas Day. However, the true conquest spanned 6 years and was a bloody, brutal undertaking that inflicted misery upon many people living in England at the time. In the aftermath, William and his followers transformed England, totally in the case of landholding, and gradually in the case of its culture, with the adoption of new laws and customs, and eventually the creation of a new language in modern English, which blends the pre-conquest Germanic language of the Anglo-Saxons in the post-conquest French of the Normans. By temperament, William was by all accounts a relatively amiable character, though this likely concealed a more ruthless, reserved streak. He was clearly religious and founded many churches, though he held limited regard for the supposed universal sovereignty of the Pope in Rome. His governance of the church within his own domains foreshadowed Henry VIII's later attempts by nearly 500 years. He appears to have been faithful to his wife Matilda throughout their long marriage, an unusual occurrence for the time. Nevertheless, he was largely uncultured, demonstrating little patronage for learning in England or France. He pursued his political and military ambitions with a determined single-mindedness, born of a strong character. It was this unwavering resolve that brought the Normans to England and fundamentally transformed the country forever. What is your opinion of William the Conqueror? Was he a great king who unified England after many years of unstable monarchy? Or was he an ambitious tyrant who brutalized England in his efforts to impose Norman rule? Please share your thoughts in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.